The wagon wheel gave a final, splintering groan and seized. Dust, fine as milled flour, settled in a silent plume around the motionless wreck. Anneliese did not flinch. She stared ahead at the vast, bleached expanse of the plains, at the low, bruised-looking mountains on the horizon that seemed a lifetime away. Behind her, from the shaded interior of the wagon, came a dry, rattling cough, a sound more terrifying than the silence of the land. Her mother. The air was thin and hot, and the sun beat down on the cracked leather of the driver's seat. In the distance, perhaps a mile off, was a collection of buildings, a large, sturdy-looking house, a massive barn, and several smaller outbuildings, all huddled together as if for comfort against the sheer emptiness of the world. Closer, set apart from the main cluster, was a smaller, more solitary structure. It sagged, its roofline bent like a tired old back. This was it. This was the place her last few coins and a desperate letter had secured. A place to work. A place to survive. She climbed down, her boots sinking into the dust, her bones aching with a weariness that felt ancient. She walked toward the main house, her shadow long and sharp behind her. Men stopped their work as she approached, their faces hard and unreadable, weathered like the land itself. They watched her, a silent, monolithic jury. A tall man emerged from the shade of the porch, wiping his hands on a rag. His face was a mask of sun-hardened lines, his eyes the color of a winter sky. He was Ronan, the man whose name was on the letter. He did not smile. He did not offer a greeting. He simply waited. "I am Anneliese," she said, her voice raspy from the dust. "I have come to work," he nodded once, his gaze flicking past her to the broken wagon, then to the dilapidated farmhouse standing apart. The agreement was for a cook. And mending his voice was low and gravelly, a sound that seemed scraped from the very rock of the land. "Your place is over there," he gestured with his chin toward the sagging structure. There was no welcome in the gesture, no pity for her broken wagon. It was a statement of fact, a boundary drawn. He turned to go back inside. "My mother is with me," Anneliese said, her voice quiet but firm, stopping him. "She is unwell." Ronan paused, his back to her. He did not turn around. For a long moment, he said nothing. The silence stretched, filled only by the whisper of the wind and the distant, rhythmic clang of a hammer. "See that she keeps to your house," he said, and then he was gone, disappearing into the darkness of the main building. Anneliese stood alone in the yard, the eyes of the other men still on her. She had not been welcomed. She had been assigned a place. She turned and walked back toward the wagon, toward the sound of that fragile, persistent cough. The work was just beginning. She led the tired horse the rest of the way, the broken wheel dragging a deep scar in the dirt. Her mother, Maeve, remained in the back, a small, frail bundle wrapped in every blanket they owned. Anneliese brought the wagon to a stop beside the derelict farmhouse. Up close, it was worse than she had imagined. The wood was silvered and splintered with age, warped by 100 seasons of sun and snow. Several windows were boarded over, and the one that was not was missing its glass, a dark, gaping mouth. The porch steps groaned in protest under her weight, and the door hung crookedly on one hinge. She pushed it open. A cloud of dust, thick with the smell of decay and nesting mice, billowed out to greet her. Inside, the gloom was heavy. What little light pierced the boarded windows illuminated a scene of profound neglect. Cobwebs, thick as shrouds, draped every corner. The floor was a patchwork of warped planks and dark, missing spaces. There was one large room, dominated by a massive stone fireplace black with soot, its hearth filled with dirt and fallen debris. A smaller room branched off, little more than a closet. That was all. There was no stove, no furniture, no sign that a human had lived here in a very long time. This was not a house, it was a ruin. A wave of cold despair washed over her, so potent it threatened to buckle her knees. She had brought her sick mother to this. To die in this. She leaned against the doorframe, her eyes closed, listening to the wind whistle through the cracks in the walls. Then, she heard it again, that small, dry cough from the wagon. It was the only anchor she had. The despair receded, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. She would not let this place be the end. She went back outside and gently helped May from the wagon. Her mother was light as a bundle of sticks, her breathing shallow. Annalise half carried her inside, settling her in the cleanest corner she could find, propped up against their meager belongings. "Just for a little while, Mama," she whispered, though her mother's eyes were cloudy and unfocused. Maeve only shivered. Annalise went back to work. She found a broken plank and, using it as a lever, pried the boards from the nearest window. Sunlight streamed in, cutting a solid, dusty shaft through the gloom. It was a start. She found a rusty bucket by the well, which, to her immense relief, yielded clear, cold water after a few complaining shrieks from the pulley. She began to sweep, then to scrub, starting with the corner where her mother lay and working her way out. The physical labor was a balm, a way to fight back the fear. She would carve a home from this hollow shell, splinter by splinter. She had to. The first days fell into a harsh rhythm. Before sunrise, she would walk to the main house kitchen, a separate building behind the primary residence, and begin preparing the morning meal for the ranch hands. She worked with what was provided: flour, lard, dried beans, and occasionally a slab of salted pork. The men ate in silence, their eyes downcast, never speaking to her beyond a clipped request for coffee. She was a ghost at the edge of their world, the provider of their sustenance and nothing more. After the morning meal was cleaned away, her time was her own. She spent it reclaiming the house. She scrubbed every surface, her hands turning red and raw from the harsh lye soap she made from ash and tallow. She used handfuls of sand from the creek bed to scour the worst of the grime from the floorboards. She found an old mattress ticking in the wagon, and spent an afternoon stuffing it with dry grasses from the field, creating a softer bed for her mother. Maeve spent most of her days in a state of drowsy lethargy, her awareness flickering like a faulty lamp. Annalise would bring her broth, coaxing her to take a few spoonfuls, her heart aching with every shallow breath her mother took. One afternoon, while sweeping near the hearth, her foot caught on a loose plank. Underneath, she found an iron ring. Pulling on it revealed a square-cut opening and a steep, narrow set of stone steps leading down into darkness. A cellar. The air that rose up was cool and smelled of damp earth and stone. Taking a precious candle, she descended. The space was not large, but it was dry-walled with fieldstone, and a set of rough-hewn shelves lined one wall. It was a larder waiting to be filled, a fortress against the coming winter. The discovery felt like a miracle, a secret gift from the house itself. She spent 2 days cleaning it, sweeping away generations of dust and evicting spiders from their kingdoms. Ronan watched her sometimes, from the porch of the main house or the wide-open door of the barn. He never approached, never offered a word of encouragement or criticism. His observation was as constant and impersonal as the sun. She could feel his gaze on her back as she hauled buckets of water, as she patched a hole in the roof with scavenged planks and tar. She knew she was being tested, her worth measured by the sweat on her brow and the progress she made against the ruin. She did not falter. Each repaired plank, each clean surface, was a victory. Each evening, she would sit by her mother, mending the men's coarse work shirts by the light of a single candle, the house slowly, painfully, becoming hers. The nights were the most difficult. A deep, penetrating chill crept through the unsealed cracks in the walls as soon as the sun fell below the horizon. The blankets they had were thin, and Annalise often woke to find her mother shivering uncontrollably, her cough worsening in the cold air. The fireplace was not a luxury, it was the key to their survival. It loomed in the center of the room, a cold, monolithic beast of stone and soot. It had to be tamed. She began by clearing the hearth, scooping out years of accumulated dirt, leaves, and the skeletal remains of small animals that had fallen down the chimney. Then she tackled the chimney itself. Using a long pole with a bundle of rags tied to the end, she pushed and scraped at the blockage from below. A shower of black, choking soot and brittle twigs rained down. She worked with a cloth tied over her face, her eyes streaming, until she could finally see a perfect, round circle of grey sky above. The flue was clear. The real problem was the firebox. The stones were cracked, and the mortar that held them had crumbled to dust. A fire lit in its current state would be a hazard, more likely to burn the house down than to warm it. She needed to rebuild it from the inside out. She remembered her father, a stonemason, talking about the right kind of clay for mortar, the kind you found deep in a creek bed, smooth and grey. She spent a morning walking the dry creek that bordered the property, her skirts hiked up, her bare feet sinking into the cool mud. She dug with her hands until she found a thick vein of the stuff. She carried it back in her apron, load after heavy load. She mixed the clay with sand from the same creek and a little water, working it with her hands until it formed a thick, pliable paste. Then, day after day, she painstakingly filled the cracks between the stones, her fingers pushing the crude mortar deep into the gaps. It was slow, meticulous work. She had to let each section dry before moving to the next, building up the layers. Ronan saw her coming and going from the creek, her arms and face smeared with grey clay. He said nothing. One of the younger ranch hands, a boy with curious eyes, paused by her door once to watch her work. He shook his head and walked away, a silent judgment on her foolishness. She ignored them all. The fireplace became her singular focus. It was a battle of wills between her and the cold, and she would not lose. Finally, it was done. The mortar was dry and hard. The hearth was clean. With trembling hands, she laid a small pile of kindling inside and struck a match. The flame caught, and for the first time, smoke curled not into the room, but straight up the chimney, drawn into the sky. The small, hopeful fire in the hearth was a victory, but it was a hungry one. It demanded fuel, and the nights were growing steadily colder. The small pile of scavenged twigs and branches she had collected would not last. She needed a real woodpile, a fortress of fuel to see them through the winter she knew was coming. The plains around the ranch were mostly grassland, but in the low, rolling hills to the west, there was a sparse forest of hardy pine and gnarled, resilient oak. That was where she would have to go. The first obstacle was the lack of a proper tool. She searched the outbuildings and the area around the barn, feeling like a thief, until she found it half buried in the dirt behind the blacksmith's shed, a rusty, pitted axe head, abandoned and forgotten. The handle was long gone. She spent the better part of a day searching for a suitable piece of wood, finally finding a straight, strong branch of hickory that had fallen in a storm. She sat for hours, using a sharp piece of flint and a borrowed file from the smithy to shape the end, carefully fitting it into the eye of the axe head and securing it with a small wooden wedge. It was a clumsy tool, poorly balanced, but it was hers. Every afternoon, after her cooking and mending duties were done, she would walk to the hills. The trek itself was arduous, the ground uneven and rocky. The repetition of it settled into her bones. The crunch of her boots on the dry earth, the cry of a lone hawk overhead, the growing ache in her shoulders. She sought out deadfall first, trees already felled by wind or lightning. The wood was seasoned and dry, perfect for burning. Swinging the axe was awkward at first. It was heavy, and her blisters broke and bled. But she learned the rhythm of it, the way to use her body's weight to drive the blade deep into the wood. She learned to read the grain, to find the weaknesses. Each sharp crack as a log split was a small, satisfying triumph. She could not carry much at once. She would haul the split logs back to the house one or two at a time, her arms straining, her back screaming in protest. Slowly, methodically, a pile began to grow against the farmhouse's west wall. It started as a small heap, then grew to a respectable mound, and then became a long, neatly stacked wall of wood. The ranch hands noticed. They saw her return each day, covered in sweat and sawdust, her face set with determination. They saw the woodpile rise, a tangible measure of her relentless labor. It was a monument to her will to survive, and it stood as a silent rebuke to their indifference. It was a language they understood far better than words. The small patch of earth behind the farmhouse was baked hard by the sun, choked with weeds and stones. To anyone else, it was a useless scrap of land. To Annalise, it was a promise. It was a place to grow food, to fight back against the meager rations of salted meat and dried beans. She found a broken spade head near a collapsed shed and, like with the axe, fashioned a new handle for it. The work of turning the soil was brutal. The ground was stubborn, resisting her at every push, jarring her arms and back. She spent a week clearing the plot, pulling weeds, and digging out rocks, her hands becoming a mass of calluses. One morning, she came out her door to find a small burlap sack on the step. Inside were a dozen potato seeds and a scoop of dried beans for planting. There was no note, no sign of who had left it. But she knew. It was Ronan's silent acknowledgement. It was not kindness, not yet, but it was a recognition of her effort. She planted the seeds with a reverence she might have once saved for prayer, placing each one in the newly turned earth as if it were a jewel. She hauled bucket after bucket of water from the well, nursing the small plot, willing life to take root in the unforgiving soil. While the seeds germinated, she foraged. She had learned from her mother in better times which plants could be trusted. She gathered wild onions from the banks of the creek, found patches of bitter but edible greens, and dug for starchy roots that could be boiled into a passable mush. She was relentless in her search for sustenance. As the ranch prepared for winter, slaughtering a steer, she was given the offal and leftover scraps. She wasted nothing. She rendered the fat into tallow for candles and soap. She boiled the bones for days to make a rich, nourishing broth, which she carefully stored in jars in the cool of the cellar. She salted and dried strips of the tougher meat, hanging them from the rafters she had repaired. The cellar began to transform. The empty shelves she had scrubbed clean now held jars of preserved greens, sacks of foraged roots, and the precious potatoes from her garden, which had finally yielded a small but vital harvest. The space was no longer a dark, empty hole beneath the house. It was a larder. It was security. It was the scent of earth and life, a tangible defense against the encroaching cold and the gnawing fear of starvation. Every time she descended the stone steps, she felt a profound sense of accomplishment. She was a provider. She was building a life from the scraps the world had thrown her. The sky, which had been a brilliant, hard blue for months, turned a milky gray. The wind shifted, carrying a new and sharper bite. The first snowflakes fell not with gentle beauty, but like tiny, stinging needles driven by the wind. They melted at first on the hard-packed earth, but they were relentless. By evening, a thin, white blanket covered everything, silencing the world and erasing the familiar lines of the landscape. Annalise stood at her small window, the one she had painstakingly fitted with a salvaged piece of glass, and watched the snow fall. The world she had come to know, the brown plains, the distant hills, the sharp outlines of the ranch buildings, was disappearing under a soft, indifferent whiteness. The farmhouse, once a ruin, was now a sanctuary. The fire in the repaired hearth burned steadily, its orange light pushing back the encroaching twilight and filling the single room with a deep, comforting warmth. The cracks in the walls, which she had chinked with a mixture of mud and dried grass, no longer whistled with drafts. Her mother was asleep in the bed she had built, her form a small mound under the blankets. Maeve's breathing was still shallow, and the cough remained a constant, quiet rhythm in the background of their lives, but she was warm. She was fed. She was safe. The wall of firewood stacked against the house was now dusted with snow, a reassuring bulk against the coming storms. The cellar below her feet was stocked. She had done it. She had taken a shell and made it a home. She had faced the coming winter and prepared for its onslaught. The rhythm of the ranch changed with the snow. The men's work contracted, focusing on the barn and the livestock. Their world, and hers, shrank. Her trips to the main kitchen were quick, bundled dashes through the deepening snow. The rest of the day was spent inside the small stone house. The isolation was absolute. Days could pass without her speaking to another soul besides her sleeping mother. Yet, it was not a desperate isolation. It was a secure one, a peace she had earned with torn hands and an aching back. She would sit by the fire, mending or grinding flour with a small stone quern, the silence broken only by the crackle of the flames and the howling of the wind outside. The storm was a formidable enemy, but for the first time since her husband's death, she felt she had the weapons to fight it. She had her small, warm fortress, her stores of food, and the indomitable will that had gotten her this far. The winter had come, but she was ready. The cold deepened, settling over the land with a crushing weight. The world outside was a stark canvas of white snow and black, skeletal trees. Inside the small house, Annalise fought a different battle. Maeve's quiet, persistent cough had turned wet and ragged. A fever took hold, blooming on her mother's cheeks in two bright, alarming spots. Her breathing became a painful, rasping struggle. Annalise used every remedy she knew. She brewed teas from the dried herbs she had gathered, forced warm broth between her mother's cracked lips, and kept cool, damp cloths on her forehead. But the fever climbed, relentless. Maeve grew delirious, murmuring names from a lifelong past. Annalise sat by her side, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach. Her supplies were dwindling. The herbs were almost gone, and she knew they were not enough. The blizzard raged for 2 days, trapping her in the house, the wind shrieking like a predator. On the third day, the wind died down, leaving behind a world of profound silence and deep, impassable drifts. Desperation gnawed at her. She could not let her mother die. Not after everything. Bundling herself in every layer she possessed, she stepped out into the blinding white. The snow was waist-deep in places, a thick, heavy powder that fought her with every step. The short distance to the main house was a monumental journey. She fell twice, the cold seeping through her clothes, her lungs burning. She finally reached the porch, exhausted, and pushed her way into the main house. Ronan was there, sitting alone by the great hearth, patiently mending a piece of leather harness. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. She did not plead. She did not weep. Her voice, when it came, was low and strained, stripped of all emotion but desperation. "My mother is failing. The fever is high," she offered, no more, no less. It was a simple, terrible statement of fact. He held her gaze for a long moment. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the hiss and crackle of the fire. He was studying her, seeing past the snow on her clothes and the exhaustion on her face to the core of her will. He gave a single, sharp nod. He set down the harness, rose from his chair, and pulled on his heavy sheepskin coat and hat. He walked past her and out the door without a word. Annalise waited, shivering, not sure what she had just done. A few minutes later, he returned. He held out a small, dark bottle. "Whiskey," he said. His voice was rough. "For the fever." A spoonful in some hot water, then he pushed a cloth-wrapped bundle into her other hand. And this, it was a solid parcel of dried venison. For broth it was more than medicine and food. It was help. It was an acknowledgement of her struggle. An old, wiry ranch hand who had been watching from the corner of the room met her eyes and gave a slow, deliberate nod. The ice was beginning to break. The journey back to her own small house was a blur of snow and desperate hope. She stumbled inside, the bottle and the venison clutched to her chest like precious jewels. The warmth of the room enveloped her, a stark contrast to the frozen world outside and the cold fear inside her. She immediately set to work, her movements precise and focused. She put a small pot of water on the fire to heat and began slicing thin strips of the venison. The rich, smoky smell filled the room, a scent of life and strength. She administered the whiskey first, mixing a small amount with warm water and patiently coaxing the liquid past her mother's lips. Then she tended the fire, adding logs from the dwindling pile inside, ensuring the room remained a cocoon of steady warmth. For 3 days and 3 nights, she did not truly sleep. She dozed in a straight-back chair pulled close to the bed, her senses on high alert, waking at every change in her mother's breathing. Her world shrank to the confines of that small room, the bed, the fire, the rhythm of care. Each morning, just after dawn, she would hear a soft thud on her porch. The first day, it was Ronan, leaving a small stack of freshly split pine and a pail of milk from the cow, its surface still warm. He did not knock. He did not speak. He simply appeared out of the grey morning, left his offering, and disappeared back into the snow. His vigil was as silent and steadfast as her own. The second morning, beside the wood and the milk, was a small, lumpy sack containing half a dozen eggs. She knew it wasn't from Ronan. It was from the others. They had seen their boss's actions and followed suit, their collective respect expressing itself in these small, vital gifts. The third morning, there was a small, dense loaf of bread. These gestures were more than charity. They were messages. You are not alone. We see you. We see your fight. Annalise nursed her mother with the broth from the venison, the milk, the eggs. She fought the fever with the whiskey and the relentless, enveloping warmth of the fire. On the fourth morning, as a pale sun finally broke through the clouds, she woke from a deep doze to a profound stillness. The ragged, painful rasp of her mother's breathing was gone. In its place was a quiet, even rhythm. She rushed to the bedside. Maeve's forehead was cool to the touch. The fever had broken. Her mother's eyes fluttered open, and for the first time in weeks, they were clear. They found Annalise's face. "My girl," Maeve whispered, her voice a fragile thread of sound. Relief, so powerful it was physically painful, washed through Annalise. She leaned her forehead against the rough wood of the bedframe and finally allowed herself to weep. The world began to thaw. The immense drifts of snow shrank day by day, melting under a sun that grew stronger with each passing morning. The sound of dripping water was constant, a gentle percussion marking the retreat of winter. Brown patches of earth appeared on the plains, and the creek, once frozen solid, began to flow again with a joyful murmur. The ranch slowly came back to life, the men's voices louder, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer once again ringing through the clear, crisp air. Inside the farmhouse, Maeve recovered slowly but steadily. The color returned to her cheeks, and the terrible cough faded into memory. She was still weak, but she could sit up in bed, and then in a chair by the window, watching the world's rebirth. Her presence, quiet and alert, transformed the house. It was no longer just Annalise's solitary fortress, it was a shared home, filled with the low murmur of conversation and the small routines of recovery. Annalise tended to her mother, but she also looked outward. The patch of earth she had fought to cultivate was emerging from the snow. She saw, with a surge of profound hope, the tiny green spears of wild onion she had planted and the first hearty leaves of the potatoes pushing up through the damp soil. The woodpile was much smaller now, a testament to the long, cold battle they had fought and won. But it had been enough. It had held. One evening, as the last light of the day painted the sky in shades of rose and violet, she heard footsteps on her porch. It was Ronan. This time, he did not leave a package and retreat. He stood at the open door, his hat in his hands. He looked past her, into the warm, firelit room, at the neat shelves, the clean floor, and at Maeve, who gave him a small, polite nod from her chair. His gaze returned to Annalise. The harsh lines of his face seemed softer in the twilight. "The melt has shown some damage," he said. His voice was as low and rough as ever, but the edge was gone. "The roof on the main house needs mending. Some shingles torn loose by the wind." He paused, looking down at the hat he was turning in his hands. "I could use help." Someone with a steady hand. It was not an order. It was not a statement of work owed. It was an invitation, a request for partnership. Annalise looked from his face to the small, secure world she had built with her own two hands. She looked at her mother, safe and warm. She had arrived with nothing but a broken wagon and a dying woman. Now, she had a home. She had earned her place. A quiet strength settled over her, a peace that ran deeper than bone. She met his gaze directly. "I will help," she said. The silence that followed was not empty or awkward. It was filled with a new understanding, a deep and mutual respect forged in the crucible of a long, hard winter. It was the promise of spring.